apologize for the late start. So yeah, my job is to talk about improving reproductive performance, during the, before the breeding season. And this is pretty important, but it's a simple concept, but sometimes not always easy to do. So I thought I'd try to share this sort of as a timeline approach. We're going to look at some times that we can make some management decisions. And one of those is pregnancy check and possibly weaning at the same time, our calving period, and then right before synchronization or at the time of synchronization. So there's several things that we can look at, and you're going to see a constant theme throughout my program, and you probably already heard it last night and some earlier today or tonight, is managing body condition. That's going to be obviously throughout, and we know that managing body condition is pretty critical to the success of these programs. Nutrition, again, pretty much mostly energy and minerals, and then we're going to look at some of the animal health products and the timing of using those. So if we look at preg check time, pregnancy diagnosis, one of the things that we want to record at the time of pregnancy diagnosis, it's not just necessarily the stage of pregnancy, but also the body condition of the cow. And we want to preg check in time to make changes. If we've got to improve the body condition of the cows, we need to preg check in plenty enough time between the time that we preg check and the time that she calves, so that I can manage body condition. And it's really hard to manage body condition the last month or two of gestation, because her nutrition requirements go up so quickly or so dramatically. So I really need to manage body condition in that 5 to 7 months before, or 5 to 7 months of pregnancy. It's also important to go ahead and age the cows, look at their teeth and see what the condition is, try to predict the estimated calving date. Of course, that's where pregnancy palpation with an experienced technician or ultrasound have advantages. And then, can I manage, cattle by body condition? Not all operations can do that, but at least that way, if I'm planning on synchronizing, then I need to start making steps and changing my nutritional program, providing adequate energy, some protein, and then minerals. So a good mineral program, oral-based program, using the injectables if necessary, but understanding that I'm not going to be able to change mineral levels overnight. So I definitely need to maintain a good mineral program through the entire program. And then supplemental nutrition obviously is going to improve colostrum, calf health, get calves born earlier. So there's obviously a bit benefits to that over and above fertility. And then just at the time of pregnancy diagnosis, record other conditions, lamenesses, cows that have bad eyes or udders, or other conditions that maybe might make her a poor candidate for synchronization, and I want to manage her perhaps differently or perhaps cull her. But anyway, that's something that I want to go ahead and note in my records. And then if I can give animal health products at this time, that might be a really good time to consider vaccinating cattle or other products versus during that postpartum period or at the time of synchronization. So if I can move some of my vaccinations, at this time, it might be a better time to do that, then that won't have a negative impact on my synchronization and either my pregnancy rate for embryo transfer or artificial insemination. And then, of course, if weaning is an option, especially for thin cows, that's a great way to also manage body condition. So calving time, I want to make sure that I'm providing adequate intervention. I want to manage and minimize calving problems. Those cows that have calving problems are more risk to being infertile, not breeding back, or breeding back late. So I definitely want to, manage those cows appropriately. Again, nutrition, I don't want to lose body condition after calving. I want to make sure that those cows have adequate energy and that they're supplemented appropriately. And appropriate supplementation is going to be different. I'm in Georgia, but there's people, on the program, listening to the program tonight, from the West and Wyoming, Montana, West Coast, and other places. And so supplementation from Georgia might be very different to supplementation out in the mountain region. So whatever resources you have, you want to make sure that we're we're providing adequate energy, or it might be protein on stockpiled pasture or something like that. The mineral program, that's a constant. We need to manage our minerals. Good oral program, plus or minus the injectables that are available. Vaccinations, if I'm using modified lives, I really want to give those at least 45 days prior to breeding, but that's going to really limit who gets synchronized, because if I'm synchronizing cows, prior to breeding, or if I'm synchronizing cows and I'm giving a modified live, then there's only going to be, cows in the very first 30 days that have calved that are going to be able to be vaccinated and synchronized. So it may be that there's cows that I don't synchronize, or it may be there's cows that I don't vaccinate. So I really do need to consider, timing of vaccination, and then the type of vaccine that I'm using in that protocol. So that's a good conversation to have with my veterinarian. And several people have mentioned this, that we need to look at all of these programs, synchronization programs and animal health programs, in a holistic manner, and understand that there's times that I may have to use a program that may have detrimental effects one way or the other, but it really has to be a balance in my management program, of the things that I need. If I really need a vaccination program, then I want to err toward that. Or if I really want to make pregnancies, then I may change my vaccination program. Synchronization, again, sufficient body condition, and then days postpartum. You're going to see this. Several people have different. Some people might want to be aggressive and get on down to 45 days postpartum, but in embryo transfer programs that I set up years ago, we typically looked at recips that were, at least 55 days. But again, that's going to be body condition dependent. If I'm synchronizing cattle at that point in time, I want to avoid herd health products. There's really no good studies on some of these other things like dewormers or insecticide, our flyporons and that kind of thing, that show a detrimental effect. But in some cases, there might be a trade-off. If I'm synchronizing during the summertime and I've got a lot of fly pressure on my cows, I may want to go ahead and use a poron product, because it's going to help my cows relax. They're going to not bunch up. They're not going to have a lot of problems. They're going to go ahead and eat. They're going to graze. And so fly control is going to be essential. So it's really important, and it's going to help with my heat patches if I'm using those, because if I've got a lot of flies on the backs of cows, they're swinging their tails. That's going to hit the patches, snatch some of them off, or it's going to actually, in some case, rub some of that off and make the patches less effective. As far as protocols, there's really no single protocol. I've had really good results with the 5-day seeder, 7-day seeders, 7 and 7, 14 days. Heat detection or timed AI is going to dictate some of the protocols. How many times those cattle go through the chute, if I have the ability to sort calves, what kind of facilities I have, labor, those kind of things. So really, I've had great results with protocols, and I've also had disasters with some of the same protocols. So there's no single protocol that works. Appreciate, the talk last night on protocol on Jordan Thomas's program. This is the Iowa Beef Center, as Dr. Fontes just mentioned. Go to that, look at it, play with it, and see. So, and then of course the products that we use, we need to make sure we use those appropriately, because if we don't, that could also be a source of disaster if we're not giving GnRH appropriately, or in some cases I've had clients use prostaglandin on the front end and GnRH on the back end, and of course that didn't work very well either. Do want to mention heifers. Obviously, they need to be reproductively mature and cycling, and perhaps if I don't see a lot of estrus activity, I may want to palpate prior to setting those up. They obviously need to be good weight and age, and of course that's going to be species specific. Down in the southeast, we do have some eared cows, so they might need to be a little heavier and a little older before we set them up. And again, the timing of the animal health products, herd health, we definitely don't want to vaccinate less than 30 days, but it would be really good to get that second dose of modified live, at least 60, maybe 45 days before we're synchronizing in AI. And of course, there are heifer specific synchronization protocols. And obviously I want to make sure I'm using calving sires on these heifers. Again, just another, picture of this as far as looking at the timeline. There's 3 key places here that we can look at management decisions, and of course, preg check and weaning, and then those things, those issues around calving and then synchronization. So, and in summary there, I want to definitely manage our nutrition and the body condition of those cows. I want to make sure that they're always in good body condition and not losing body condition. Of course, the timing of the herd health products is a consideration anytime I'm getting ready. And preparation for synchronization is not the day that I'm putting a seeder in or giving a shot of GnRH. It's actually weeks and months prior to that. I want to make sure I'm administering those products properly. Low stress handling, cannot be overemphasized. And then I definitely want to use those key times to make decisions. So with that, I've actually probably went over a minute or two, but I definitely need to make plenty of room for George and Kai.
Thanks, Lee. I will swap over here and hopefully everybody's seeing the correct screen. And so my job is more to talk about what's going on during the breeding season. And so when we think about, as Lee has shown, getting cows set up and everything, when I think about during the breeding season, there's 3 big things that really stand out at that time that we really need to worry about. And the first one is estrus detection. And so, slide's moving. There we go. And so when we think about estrus detection, it doesn't matter if we're doing heat detection, if it's natural service, if we're doing fixed time AI, cows need to show estrus to have good fertility. And so the way to think about that is successful insemination requires them to be detected in estrus and inseminated at the correct time. It doesn't matter who's doing the insemination, we need that to occur. And when we think about that, there were some discussions last night. Pedro actually showed it earlier too, figuring out how important estrus detection is. This was a study done at Colorado State several years ago now, where they took a herd, they synchronized them the same way, and they did intensive heat detection, which would have been computerized heat detection, where those animals were monitored 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, or casual, which was 30 minutes morning and evening. And if we look at that over the same period of time, you can see a 30% difference in synchronization rates. Well, how does that translate? Conception rates are the percent of cows that conceive out of those that semen was put into. And if we look here, the intensive heat detection, 82% conception rates, the casual 62. Now you may ask, why is there a difference here? What is causing that difference when all of those animals were inseminated and detected in estrus? Well, we also have to think about the timing. Well, as we go across, synchronization rate times conception rate gives you pregnancy rate. So pregnancy rate is the percent of cows that conceive out of the total that are in the group. Well, if we missed 30% of them here, and we have lower conception rates, we can see our pregnancy rates are quite a bit lower. Most people will be very happy with 71% pregnancy rates on a synchronized AI program. 35%, most people are very disappointed in. And we realize this comes from the amount of time spent detecting estrus. Why we get that difference in conception rates? Well, Dr. Sacchi did some really nice work looking at what goes on after an animal shows estrus. And if we look here, hour 0 is the onset of estrus. And so if we breed animals at this time, we have low fertilization rates, but high embryo quality. Why is that? There's inadequate sperm life. Our AM/PM rule, where we're about 12 hours after the onset of estrus with conventional semen, gives us that compromise. because as we get later after the onset of estrus, we can see conception rates or pregnancy rates starting to drop again. And that's because if the egg is waiting on the sperm, we start to get an aged oocyte. And so we have high fertilization rates because the sperm get there, the oocyte is waiting on it, but we have lower embryo quality. And so realizing that compromise and knowing the correct time to AI gets to be very important. So then the question becomes, when do animals exhibit estrus? Now, this is the summary of 3 different studies. And if we look, we can see when people can heat detect early in the morning, 26%, later in the evening, 26%. But if you can't be there during the day, if you're working, or at night, you still end up losing quite a few animals. And if we do the math on this, there's 56% of animals that show estrus between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. And so unless you're a grad student in graduate school looking at things to do, being out detecting estrus around the clock is usually not everybody's priority. And so there are tremendous synchronous or estrus detection aids that are out there. Everything from Gomer bowls to tail chalk, Estrotec patches, electronic devices. We have those abilities to use these that can tell us which animals exhibit estrus while we are not there watching them. Now, we still have to put in and observe them frequently because we need to know when those animals showed estrus to get animals to conceive at the correct time. So all of that goes with timing of AI and estrus detection. But I mentioned earlier also fixed time AI. Well, if we're doing a fixed time AI, those protocols have been developed to avoid having to do estrus detection. But it is still important to know those animals are showing estrus at the correct time. One of the master students who worked with me a few years ago did a meta-analysis. There's 26 studies listed in here. There's over 10,000 animals. They include heifers and cows, all the recommended synchronization protocols. And if you look, you can see this variation that occurs across each one of these protocols for cows that show estrus. What is the benefit to it? Well, if you look across all 26 studies, on average, there was a 27% increase in conception rates for animals that showed estrus prior to fixed time AI compared to those animals that didn't. And so when you think about that 27%, that's an extra 27 AI pregnancies out of every 100 cows if they show estrus prior to fixed time AI. And so we can see the tremendous impact, and we can get into all the details of what was going on with sperm transport and changes in the uterine environment. But just to quickly show some things, we did a study on a group of heifers where we came in, had animals that showed estrus or didn't prior to fixed time AI, and we flushed embryos on day 6. And what we can see is there's no difference in embryo recovery rate. There was 60 to 70% of the embryos recovered. And so it's not a ovulation effect. But when we look at these animals that showed estrus, we see there's better embryo stage. So these are actually more developed embryos, a 4.5 compared to a 3.7. There's better quality, actually quality grade 1.1 to 1.8. Part of that, we change the uterine environment and we allow more sperm to get to the site of fertilization. When we think about that, accessory sperm numbers tell us how many sperm can get to the site of fertilization. And when we look at these accessory sperm numbers, these animals that had shown estrus, on average, they had 25 accessory sperm versus only 7. So we know about 3 times the amount of sperm is getting to the site of fertilization. There was no difference in number of dead cells or total cells, but what's interesting is as we look at the percent of cells that were alive on day 6, in those animals that we recovered an embryo from that had shown estrus, almost 91% of the cells were alive versus only 70% in those that had not shown estrus. Well, when we think about only 70% of the cells of 50 cells, we can see those embryos have a much harder time surviving and going on. And so when we look at those out to full pregnancy, we can see estrus is having a big impact, whether we're breeding off of estrus, whether we're doing a fixed time AI, and even if a bull is turned out, if that animal is not showing good estrus, he's not going to detect them and breed them. So that's one of the key points at the beginning. The next thing that was mentioned a little bit last night was semen handling. When we go to AI, it's important that semen handling is considered. When we think about natural service, we need to be thinking breeding soundness exams and good fertility. And we don't have time to go into everything, but I want to briefly show a student that worked with me a few years ago had an interest in doing how does semen handling impact sperm motility. And this is just a couple of slides from what she did. We did all kinds of things. There was actually 9 different treatments, one being the control. But you can see here there was a discussion last night on pocket thawing. And you can see how pocket thawing can have a big negative impact. Now, what's interesting is we did 14 different bulls in this study. And some of those bulls you could not tell a single bit of difference in. They were up with everybody else, and other bulls were much lower. And so as the discussion was last night, knowing the product and what there is very important. The other ones that really stand out is if we look here, this is if the gun or the semen got hot after thawing. And then this one here that was also down low was actually if 5 straws of semen was put into the thaw bath at one time. And so we can think about all of these little things that you've probably seen people do that can have negative impacts on sperm motility. Well, what does that actually look like? So these are some images on how we analyze this. This is a sample of the control. The little blue lines tell you progressive sperm. And these were taken 20 minutes after thawing. We compare that to our pocket thaw method. And we can see one lone sperm up here thawing. Same bull, everything done the same way except for the temperature it was thawed at. And so semen handling gets to be very critical as we look at things, and even more so as we talk about sex semen. Sex sorted semen is in 1/4 cc straws and can be very susceptible to temperature and handling issues. And so when we look at those things, we can see everybody starts off at the same point, but if it is held at different temperatures, we can see cooling the straw or warming the straw, how much that affects the sperm over as short as a 15-minute period of time compared to if things are done correctly. So semen handling is very critical. The last thing I want to touch on is inseminator efficiency. And so if we think about during breeding season and we think about what's going on, getting cows in estrus, handling the semen correctly, and then getting semen in the correct location. We know from lots of research that when semen is deposited in the correct location at the correct time, fertilization occurs greater than 95% of the time. Now, those are cows, like I said, detected in estrus and good quality semen. Where is the correct location? In the uterine body. We can see right here into the uterine body, because what we want to happen is as we deposit that semen, we want it to freely flow into both horns. There is no benefit from any of the data I'm aware of to show that putting semen further down into the horns has any benefit on conception rates. But we do know that if we put semen into the cervix instead of the uterine body, there's actually a decrease in conception rates. And we can see this one study estimated about a 10% decrease. That's probably the lowest decrease. My guess is we would see more than that on a lot of situations. We do know it happens. There was a study that actually looked at the attempts, and they reported about 20% of the time semen ended up deposited in the cervix versus the uterine body. And as I said, there's several studies that report no benefit to going deeper into the horns. Actually, you can have negative effects because if you scratch the endometrium and get blood into the uterus, you get an immune response and can have negative effects on fertility. And so if we're thinking about during the breeding season, estrus detection, semen handling, and semen placement are critical during that time period. And now I will let Kai take over and tell us about after the breeding season.
All right, thanks, George. Let me get my screen shared here. Okay, can everybody see that okay and hear me okay? All right. So I think George, set it up great here to talk about really what you do after AI and what you do after you get the cattle bred and as you move forward. And I guess that, really this moves into sort of this what we view as sort of this downtime period, right, when all the work has been done, but is very critical in regards to the success of the program that we've just finished, running or completing. And I would say that, when you think about a fixed time AI program, or think about any reproductive technologies program, it really doesn't end until you get those cattle preg checked and that they're safe into about the 60, 70 day range of gestation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and what goes into that. If we think about what happens in the developing pregnancy as we go through for those first month and a half of gestation, we go from basically an oocyte that's fertilized with the sperm, which was what George just talked about, happens about 95% of the time when everything goes correct, all the way to developing into a blastocyst, hatching out of that blastocyst, elongating to form, get my laser pointer, elongating to form an elongated conceptus, and then eventually setting up this connection with the uterine environment where you have placentomes and you start to exchange nutrients that happen about, into the 20, 30 days of gestation. So as we go through this point, theoretically, we think about how much contribution comes from the male here early on when you have fertilization, and then over time, really playing a heavier role on the female side, getting to sort of nutrient exchange, etc. And if we look really closely at how intimate this connection is between the sort of the uterus and the developing conceptus, this is the embryo here, about into the day 20-ish range. So the embryo and the conceptus is here in the middle. This is the placenta outlined here, and this is the uterus on the outside. And you can start to see how intimate that connection is and how important that is. And obviously, what affects that? What affects that process going correctly? What causes problems in that issue or in those mechanisms as we move forward? And I think that's really what's important, because what we want to do in the next 2 months after the AI is to minimize any chances to cause problems or cause embryonic mortality. And so as we get into this time point, the biggest issue that we have is embryonic mortality and pregnancy loss. And so let's look at a little bit of what those numbers look like. So I'm going to break this down based on a meta-analysis that one of my students, Sydney Reese, did a few years back, where basically we broke down periods of pregnancy development and periods of embryonic development into different waves and looked at different stages of pregnancy loss. And so as we go through here, we have this first period of loss, which is this fertilization and pre-blastocyst loss. I'm not going to talk much about this. George has already mentioned this a little bit. When everything goes correctly, this is thought to be very low, and there's very few studies actually done in this time point because they're terminal projects. Then as we get from really the blastocyst stage to about day 28 to 31 of gestation, this is that period of early embryonic development. Okay, so this is where the embryo goes from a round spherical stage, elongates, basically signals to the maternal environment that the embryo is present, and goes forward with gestation. As we get forward from there, going from about day 28 to day 45, after you've had initiation of heartbeat, we consider this next phase of development called late embryonic development. And this period of development is really critical in regards to establishing the maternal and embryo communication. So this is that period of time where you're really going to start to have a lot of interdigitation and interwinding of that conceptus actually into the uterus to set up those connections. Then as we go forward from there, we get into fetal development. And this is really once the time the embryo starts to take the shape of the fetal calf, has digits, has legs. We can start to see structure at that point. Now, 99% of the pregnancy loss that we see in beef cattle, especially in reproductive technologies programs, comes in this first 45 to 50 days of gestation. Now, if you have pregnancy loss after 50 to 60 days of gestation, most of the time that's going to be from some disease-based insult of the herd. And as Lee did a really nice job talking about vaccines, et cetera, those are all things to consider and all risks to weigh as you look at sort of that time period as well. So let's move forward. Let's look at the actual numbers during these phases of embryonic and late embryonic development, and really how much pregnancy loss and what are some realistic expectations for this next 30 to 45 days. And I think just as we think about what are the things we do from a management point of view after AI, maybe more importantly, start to thinking about the things that Lee and George have talked about and starting to assess what might my success be when I get to my first pregnancy diagnosis. And so these are some numbers that can hopefully help you out and think about what might be possible in this range. So first, let's look at the early embryonic mortality side. So this is the first 30 to 31 days of gestation. This is all data combined has over 50,000 diagnostic records. The overall pregnancy loss from all cattle included is about 48% in the first 30 to 31 days. So let's break this down and look at it across these different three different categories. So we have nulliparous, which are heifers, primiparous, and multiparous cows. And this is the number of studies, N equals 49, 17, and 39. Okay, so total there's 50,000 head here, but this is how many studies were in each one. And if you look here, you can see that these primiparous cows have the highest pregnancy loss embryonic mortality compared to the other two parity groups. And it's somewhere in about the 55% range if you go down here on the bottom. If we go to the next category and look at subspecies, which is obviously an important consideration for folks in the Southeast and in tropical and subtropical climates, these Bos indicus influenced cattle compared to Bos taurus influenced cattle are going to have about a 6% higher pregnancy loss in the first 30 to 31 days compared to Bos taurus cows. Go down to breeding method. So we have AI, these are cows that are bred on the AM/PM rule. Then we have fixed time AI, obviously cows that are appointment-based bred. We have embryo transfers. And what you can see, and in both of these cases, fixed time AI and embryo transfer data sets have higher pregnancy loss in the first 30 to 31 days compared to cows that are bred based on estrus. And again, this would go back to exactly what George was just talking about. And if I split out this fixed time AI group and I showed you the cows that were in estrus versus those that weren't, we would also see a separation there as well. So in the first 30 to 31 days, if you did a pregnancy diagnosis, this is what those numbers look like for an actual pregnancy rate. So in our primiparous cows, we could expect a pregnancy rate on average in at least these 50,000 records of 45%. If I'm running a Bos indicus herd or a majority Bos indicus herd, we're going to be somewhere in the 49%. And then on average, across the board, all parities, all subspecies included, at day 30 to 31 of gestation from a fixed time AI program, the expectation on average is to achieve 50% pregnancy rates to a single fixed time AI. Okay, which I think is, for a lot of us, when we think about this number is, yeah, a little bit lower than what we'd want it to be, but think about what you've achieved in getting cows pregnant the first day of the breeding season and how much you've sort of moved that herd forward is, and what everyone's already talked about tonight, sort of shifting those calving distributions, et cetera. Now, as we look at it in the next time frame and we build upon those exact same ideas that we just talked about, and these are basically confirmed pregnancy diagnosis following a day 30 preg check, following back up with a pregnancy diagnosis at somewhere between 60 and 100 days of gestation. Bos indicus and Bos taurus, really no difference here. Parity level, the nulliparous heifers nulliparous animals are those virgin heifers. had about an 8% pregnancy loss in the next wave of late embryonic development compared to primiparous and multiparous cows, which were closer to 5%. And this is really repeatable now. We've seen this in a lot of data sets that heifers, specifically in Bos indicus heifers that are really pushed from a puberty point of view, we're starting to see a higher rate of pregnancy loss in that late embryonic stage compared to early when we look at these other parity types. And then when we look at fixed time AI compared to embryo transfer, the AI data set, there was no major effect of that. So I'm just showing the fixed time AI and ET here. The embryo transfer data set for the folks that work in ET know this very well. You're going to have higher pregnancy loss in this time point compared to fixed time AI. So across the board, on average, there's about a 6% loss that occurs in this time window. And I'm going to show you some economics behind that on the very last slide that will make you consider sort of what that means. So after a day 100 pregnancy diagnosis, going into basically moving forward toward a calving season, you can expect on average from a fixed time AI program that 45.6% of the cows that were bred fixed time AI are still going to be pregnant and pregnant safe at day 100 of gestation. And you can start to look through these individually and start to look at where they line up. For example, primiparous cows at about 40%, which would be, you know, something that's expected as those cows are just calved. They're raising a calf. They're still growing themselves and have a lot of demand on them. And I think something that's not surprising. So there's a lot of other data in this study that I'm not really talking about. So if someone's interested, you can find that reference and look at all the other different points. But really to give you some realistic expectations of what to expect as we sort of move forward during this time point. Now, what are factors that drive this? And this is not a complete list. This is just a list of things that I've put down. Essentially, the way I like to think about it is we want to minimize change in these animals during these first 2 months following the AI. Okay, so we want to do as much as we can to maintain and to keep them in a positive plane of nutrition and keep them at a very low stress level. Now, there are genetic factors. There's heat stress that plays a role, asynchrony between the embryo and the maternal environment from an embryo transfer point of view. A lot of effects from the sire that we've seen that have an effect on that. George talked about semen handling. All those type of things can have an effect. Nutrition and shipping stress are going to be two things that I just want to share a little bit about, just to give you an idea. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about shipping stress. So a lot of times we get questions, after AI, when can I move cattle? After embryo transfer, when can I move cattle? And so think about, moving cattle and loading them up and transporting somewhere else is sort of a change in environment that's going to cause stress to the animal. You're going to basically move them, take them to a new environment, etc. And those are all going to be things that drive their stress level. And so when we look at this effect in regards to when to move them after AI, two studies that I have here, when you look at transport in the first 1 to 4 days after AI, you can see that it's about a 74% pregnancy rate. When they transferred after day 14, you can see you had a decrease in pregnancy rate. So 74 to 62%, both really high pregnancy rates. This is AI done with the AMPM rule. Tom Geary has a study in 2010 where the control cows had no handling, pregnancy rate of 72%, and then they had a handling 10 to 15 days after AI, decreased the pregnancy rate to about 66%. So the rule of thumb that I like to use and like to recommend is if you're going to move the cattle after AI or after embryo transfer, move them in the first 7 days. From an embryo transfer point of view, move them the day that you do the embryo transfers or the next day, right? Because the embryo is already 7 days along. So something very simple, sort of just transportation stress or minimizing stress to those animals is critical from this point of view. Now, a lot of data and a lot of different opportunities on the nutritional side. And this is a slide that I think I stole from George Perry a few years ago, but basically a lot of different points to think about here in regards to how much pregnancy loss is driven by nutritional stress or lack of nutrition or whatever it might be. and a lot of opportunities to increase or decrease it by supplementation, etc. But the thing that I want to point out is that I think from a nutrition point of view, during this period of gestation, early pregnancy, what we want to make sure is that we're minimizing change. Okay, and George did a really nice study a few years ago with heifers and turning them out from a dry lot onto grass and them learning how to graze again, etc. So the thing is that what I think is important is as you come into the breeding season, try to manage your cows or your heifers in a way that is in a positive plane of nutrition that you're going to be able to maintain them in after the breeding season, so that you don't have this sort of drastic change in the nutritional environment that they're in that's going to drastically increase or decrease their body condition score, or increase or decrease their nutritional demand, etc. And in most cases, if we can do that, I think we have a high chance to be successful. And the thing that I always think about is when we get close to the breeding season, what do we do a lot of times? We force cattle to come up. We put them in small traps. We hold them overnight because it's easier on us. A lot of times those traps don't have very good quality forage. We're feeding them poor quality hay, whatever it might be, that's really putting a nutritional stress on them. And you know, the point that really made me sort of think about this and think about how quickly things can change is a study that George Perry and Alan Bridges worked on a number of years ago, where basically they took heifers and either fed them to gain weight or to lose weight at 80% of NRC requirements, and then an embryo collection 7 days after AI. And those heifers that were nutritionally restricted, they had embryos that were less developed and of lower quality. Okay, and so this is just in 7 days of embryo development. So think about that. Think about how fast and how drastically things can change, and how, if we're not on top of things and sort of minimizing that change, how we can really hurt ourselves from a fertility point of view, even after the program is over, even if we gave all the shots the right way, if we handled semen the correct way, etc. So when it all boils down from a sort of a managing in this post-AI point of view, you know, why does it all matter? What does this really come down to from a financial point of view? And what does pregnancy loss cost us from a financial point of view? Because in the post-breeding situation, it's really about managing pregnancy loss and embryonic mortality. And so when we look at this and we take those group of animals that did everything correctly, they bred to time AI, they're going to calve to time AI on day 0 of the calving season. I just have an age times 2 pounds per day. Let's say their calves are going to weigh 550 pounds, and then just plug in some calf value compared to if you go to these ones that have an early embryo loss. Okay, they're going to at least get bred 21 days behind the counterparts that got bred from time AI, at least a cycle back. So their calves are going to weigh at least 42 pounds lighter, and you're going to be minus $68 in this model here. Versus the late embryonic loss cows, they're going to be at least 60 days later. Those calves are going to weigh less 120 pounds. That's less about $190 compared to those time AI cows. Now, when we get over to the never calves, so these are the ones that lost a pregnancy or never got bred in the first place, you know, you get nothing from them. And essentially, all these cows cost the same to maintain. So the effects of our breeding programs and the decisions that we make during our breeding programs and the success that we have in them obviously have long-term consequences for the overall efficiency of our herd. And as we start to break these numbers down and see where the positive and negative impacts come in, is really where I think the efficiency is to be had. And so again, the thing that I'll, you know, just drive home and leave you with is minimizing change as we go through that 30 to 45 days of gestation after an AI, and trying to minimize the stress that we put on those cattle is probably the best thing that we can do. And the stress can be from a nutritional point of view, a transportation point of view, a handling point of view, whatever it might be. So with that, I will open it up for questions for, I think, all of us together.